I'm Greg Giuliano. I'm an executive coach, organizational change consultant, and author. I believe leaders have the power to shape the future and change people's lives. I also believe people who challenge the status quo and go beyond usual and ordinary are rare. They're willing to go to the edge and push farther, over and over again. When I find these ultra leaders, I love to talk with them. In each episode, I talk with ultra leaders to learn how they do what they do and how they keep growing as leaders. I promise you a full dose of ultra leadership from other ultra leaders just like you in every conversation. We're at the edge of another episode. Let's jump in. Welcome to another episode of Ultra Leadership. My guest today is Reggie Townsend. As Vice President of the SAS Data Ethics Practice, Reggie leads a globally coordinated effort to empower employees and customers to deploy data-driven systems that promote human well-being, agency, and equity. Reggie is a member of the U.S. Department of Commerce National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee. The committee advises the President and National AI Initiative Office on a range of issues related to AI. Reggie also sits on the board of Equal AI, a nonprofit organization focused on reducing unconscious bias in the development and use of AI. Reggie has more than 20 years of experience in strategic planning, program management, consulting, and business development, focusing on topics such as advanced analytics, cloud computing, and AI. With visibility across multiple industries and sectors where the use of AI is growing, he combines this extensive business and technology expertise with a passion for equity and human empowerment. Welcome, Reggie.
Thank you, Greg. Good afternoon.
It is good to be with you. You are in the middle of what is probably one of the biggest advancements for us since the printing press. So I appreciate you taking the time and being here with us. So we are at the edge of something. So for you and your team being in this work of this amazing and maybe scary for some people, edge of something new, what's taking your focus and how are you working with your team to be in that space right on the edge of things?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think the best response is to assure people that while there certainly is a new moment, a lot of what we're grappling with, both from a technology perspective and a social perspective, political perspective, and from your vantage point, leadership perspective, is not very new. And so, part of the effort that my team has underway at SAS is to help people appreciate just the incrementalism that's involved here. So as an example, when we are thinking about the notion of making AI trustworthy, first we have to start with understanding that AI really is a compilation of what used to be relatively discrete technologies and capabilities. Sure, the language of algorithms feels very new as an example, but algorithms just as a decision-making apparatus have been around for years. SAS has been in business as an example for 47 years. Much of what we do is now considered AI, from data management to visualization to actual development of models, governing those models and that sort of thing. And I only share that to say, now our company isn't the only one there, but there are a lot of companies who are involved in this space that have been doing this kind of work for quite some time, doing a lot of it in back offices, right? A lot of it related to workforce automation and these sorts of things. And so we're very comfortable in the space, very familiar with the space. What is new, however, is the level of public consciousness, which is a really good thing, in my opinion. I'm sure we can talk more about that. And what is also new is newer applications. So as an example, large language models, or, a lot of people have heard of ChatGPT and Bard and others. They're taking up a lot of oxygen right now in the room. Large language models have been around for years. We've been dealing with natural language processing for years, but the ability to interface with those in very consumer friendly ways is new. And what's also new is for us to get a general sense for when you combine significant amounts of data, more data than we've ever combined before, it feels like what the AI is doing is giving us something back that feels like thinking or perceiving that we've not experienced before. And so as a consequence, yeah, we have to think more or differently about what those particular applications might mean for us in society.
What struck me there was I've keyed in on the word algorithm that before you had mentioned it in this context, I hadn't thought of it. That when we think about that, they've been around for a long time when using them, that the mental models that drive how we think about things, how we communicate with other people, our mental models are algorithms in our brains that we follow, right? We follow I'm following an algorithm right now, framing a question and talking with you. Our teams come together and establish norms that are algorithms, that we have algorithms for how we work together as a team. So thank you for that. That's a fascinating way for me to think about that and frame that. So when you and your teams are working on this kind of stuff, what are the human and team algorithms that help you to be successful as you're doing this important work?
Yeah, so we've heard the term vision for a long time in leadership circles. And
Yeah.
so I think it all starts there, to be quite honest with you. I think going from vision into something that's actual is where, commonly folks fall off the cliff. And so, we spend a lot of time thinking about, from a principles perspective, how do we envision ourselves operating? And for us, we start with a set of very discrete principles. We put definition around those principles. And then we work very hard to inculcate those principles into our enterprise, right? So it's very intentional institutionalization on our part. There are some kind of classic policy and procedural elements, but then there's some very deliberate cultural components as well. Because what we recognize is that you've got a threshold that exists, upper and lower, the lower being the law, right? You must comply with X, Y, and Z. But then the upper threshold being your principle, your envisioned self, if you will. And so we operate within that range, Greg. And we recognize that especially in an institution as old as ours, 47 years old, there are a lot of habits, or to use your language now, the algorithms of the organization that have existed for quite some time. And so we have to figure out ways to integrate with that, to make adjustments to that as appropriate for this new day. We have to recognize that there is a difference between the law and ethics and norms and practices, right? And so operating and modulating between those is very, very deliberate for us. And we have to lever each of those areas for their benefits and try to, as best we can, de-risk and not succumb to some of the downside associated with kind of past practices and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I love that. The rule and the law is the floor. It shouldn't be the bar you're reaching for. That's the floor that you stand on, right? Let's reach beyond that to what's the right thing to do, and let's not rely on, well, let's just follow the rule or the law. That's table stakes. Let's go beyond that.
That's precisely right. What's important there, we operate globally, as many large enterprises do. Yeah. And so the laws change. What is acceptable in the US may not be acceptable in parts of Asia or Europe or, the Middle East. And so principally, we want to maintain some level of stability. We know who we want to be. We know how we want to show up in the world. And so even if it is legally acceptable to, let's say, I'm going to go way out there, to discriminate against people who look a certain way or talk a certain way, if that's not how we want to show up in the world, and that's not, then we'll walk away from that business, right? And that's a leadership effort, right? That goes beyond, again, what the legal frameworks allow us to do.
Yeah. You mentioned in our conversation beforehand the three roles, the three rules that you follow as the leader of the team, like creating that culture for your team that scales out. But I thought those were fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah. So when we talked previously, I talked to you about three personas that I play,
Yeah.
and they are coach, colleague, and captain. And so one of the ways that I introduce folks to our team and kind of consistently remind folks as they're on the team is that I have those three hats. My default is captain, right? And it's not an overly authoritative captain, but it's, hey, if somebody needs to make a decision during times of indecision, that'll be me. Or in some cases, I might empower others to make decisions. In other cases, I need to coach. I need to, if I have a young manager who's trying to figure out best hiring strategies, I'm torn between two people who I really like. I'm not going to make that choice for him or her. I'm going to say, hey, have you thought about X? Have you thought about Y? And how about Z? Right. And then from a colleague perspective, sometimes you just need to show up shoulder to shoulder. Sometimes you need to roll up your sleeves and help get the work done. Sometimes you just need to be an ear, all right, to kind of let people commiserate or let people share with you some of the really good things that are going on. So we, working with my chief of staff, we have a very deliberate way of going about that with our team, with our practice. You know, we have a meeting, literally a meeting set aside for a check-in where all we do is we try to put work aside and we talk about ourselves, right? Hey, what'd you do this week? Oh, I went hiking. Hey, I went to a play and here's what it was about. Like we literally just had that call before I joined you. It creates kind of that collegial space for us to open up. Inevitably, you circle back to some work. Some work will get done, but we are very deliberate about carving out 45 minutes to have that conversation.
Really critical, right? I mean, so because business happens through relationships, and when you're moving fast, which I imagine you are moving fast, that you need a team that has relationships with one another so that when we are moving fast, something happens that because I have a relationship with this person, I make a positive assumption that even if something happens that I don't agree with, or, oh, I felt like a poke or something like that, that I remind myself, oh yeah, no, I know Reggie. He's a good guy. He wouldn't want to do anything, to hurt me. So having the relationships helps us to keep that positive intention as we're moving fast and things happen. And that's where the trust comes from. And when we're working in a virtual environment, the kind of intentional meeting, connection for connection's sake, is really vital. And so on behalf of your team, thank you for being a leader who values that and sees the need for that.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, so you've been doing this for a long time. You keep growing as a leader. How do you keep growing? What's your development journey been like, and how are you still growing?
Yeah. So, I try to find opportunities to learn outside of my discipline. I think that, one of my strengths is the ability to, I like to call it connect dots, but it really is seeing what's going on, let's say in the automotive space, or what's going on with creative design, or what's happening as it relates to journalism. And I try to understand those spaces and try to apply my learnings just from natural curiosity back to my work. Sometimes it works out just fine. Sometimes it's, comes across as a harebrained idea. And I'm okay with both. But the general idea is to figure out what dots might be connectable. And inevitably, I would say more times than not, you get the team thinking differently, right? Because it's very easy for a team to say, okay, here's the goal. I'm heads down and I got to go accomplish this goal. And you kind of get into a rhythm of the way you think and pursue that. And that's necessary. Don't get me wrong. But every now and again, you see people kind of in this repetitive loop. And one of the ways that I try to disrupt that is to say, well, how would that have been done in the following industry, right? Or what in history shows us that this particular kind of task is achievable? And so that's, especially in the AI space, is very necessary because, as you pointed out at the very top of our conversation, a lot of people see it as new, brand new. And I like to remind them, you know what? We've had ubiquitous technology integrate itself into society before. I like to point to electricity pretty frequently in those conversations and say, there was a time, a lot of us weren't around, but there was a time when electricity did not exist. And it was about a 50-year transition period from steam as our primary power source to electricity as our primary power source. You know what happened during that 50 years? Some dwellings burned down. Some people got shocked and electrocuted, but we also got light. And we got a different design for factories. It also permitted less congestion in urban areas and allowed us to electrify and bring more economic capacity to suburban and rural areas. And so it changed our orientation fundamentally as a society. AI, I believe, will very much have the same kind of impact because of its ubiquitous nature. Now, there's a need for guardrails. We can't have dwellings burning down, just like we can have people getting taken advantage of by, different AI systems. So there's a lot of repetition in the way humanity pursues itself. And so I like to just go back and find those similarities, those analogs. And I really like to use it, Greg, as a means for giving people confidence that we can do something. Because when things feel novel and new, they can feel really intimidating. And so to alleviate some of that, I try to draw from past examples.
That's important, right? Connecting the dots and saying, we've done this before and we have the capacity. We just have to be intentional about it as we go through this process where it's a journey. So I want to ask you, as a Black man in America in 2023, as an African-American leader in tech, what advice do you have, or what's just words for the, earlier, younger people following and well-intentioned allies and people in organizations? How do you message to those constituents, those two different communities in your organization or for us writ large?
Yeah, that's a good question. And thanks for the hard left turn here. So personal point of view, I'll just start, everybody is human, right? Everybody gets to be human in my book. And so that's the foundation. So while there are absolutely distinctions culturally and socially, we can get into those. The foundation of everybody is human is important for me because it allows me to be really objective before I am subjective, right? So I'm going to start off first by recognizing that everyone, for the most part, is trying to do the so-called right thing. We each have individual pursuits that we care about. Even if, the most vile person who seems like they have no redeemable qualities, somebody cares about them, right? So at the basic level, we're very similar in that respect. Now, we have to take into account the atrocities. Let's kind of keep it here in the U.S. for a second. The atrocities of things like colonialism, slavery, Reconstruction, right? The the rollback of Reconstruction, into Jim Crow, civil rights. Like, if you're studied in the history, you have to appreciate that there's a long tail that exists from the past to the present, and that we didn't get here by accident, right? And so when you encounter then younger people, which is kind of the premise of your question, in a corporate setting, I think it's important to appreciate that they are, like we did, are inheriting the history of all of that past. Yeah. And so if we, again, appreciate that past, then we have to appreciate that there are some hurdles that exist with respect to gaining access to the halls of academia, to be able to matriculate, to be able to afford to matriculate, to eventually get into a corporate setting. So a person who's gone through that journey, such as I did, is coming into a corporate setting with some, if you will, symbolic bruises and scars and cuts, right? Because that's a daunting task for those who have been historically marginalized. Maybe a little less so for others who have not been historically marginalized, but nonetheless, it exists. So this is all my buildup to say the conditioning, the advice, has to be different for young African Americans coming through corporate America than it might be if I'm talking to someone who's not of that persuasion. But at the same time, I have to recognize the history of gender, right? And the overstuff of patriarchy, right? And so as a consequence, the advice and the suggestions that I give to young women has to be different, right? So while I don't have that same background, I have to have a level of awareness that allows me to sow something into their lives that might be productive and useful. And so, to your question, your piece about allies in that question, that is my advice to them. Go and get studied, go and understand that historical long tail so that when it's time to offer something, you have something to offer that could be useful and productive. Feelings, emotions, and all of that have their place, but being able to kind of factually point back to things that have occurred and why one person might be in one situation versus another person in a different situation is also very, very important and cannot be overlooked. With respect to the young people, and this is kind of universal advice that I give to a lot of people, young and old, from a career perspective, I say, take a look at three things. It's called AIR. The acronym is AIR. And I say, you need to get yourself some AIR. The first thing is A, right? You need to make sure that whatever environment you're showing up in, that you feel like you have a sufficient level of autonomy and agency for yourself. If you ever feel like your agency is being stripped, then you probably have really low agency. If you have it, at a really high level, then you probably have high. And so I say there's a range between low and high. You decide for yourself what it is, but try to stay at medium and high. If you roll at low for too long, you're going to feel trapped. So first one is autonomy and agency. The second one is impact, right? We all want to feel like we're making an impact to our situations, to our environment, to the people, et cetera. And again, in a career setting, if you feel like the impact you're making is relatively low, that job is going to feel like a drag on you. If you feel like it's a high impact, that's the sort of stuff that gets you up in the morning. The last one is a term that some people in the technology space might remember from their, kind of the engineering and science days. Others may know it differently, but it's resonance. And resonance is scientifically can be thought about as similar frequency, right? So in society, we might call it a vibe. Do I vibe with, you or not? Do you have good energy? That sort of thing. And so I talk in terms of resonance to say you want to make sure that you're in a setting where you're doing work with people with whom you want to do work with, right? There has to be a feeling of community because everybody's looking for that agency. Everyone's looking to make impact. And if you are disconnected with the community in which you're doing work, then again, it starts to feel like a drag. And so AI or air, I say, go get some air. And again, you've got these ranges. And I say, figure it out for yourself. And I kind of coach them through that. But that's just my kind of pithy way of, of coaching and advising.
That is incredible. I am going to use that and I'm going to cite you whenever I use that. So everybody who I coach, get ready because I'm going to come at you with what Reggie just told you. That's fantastic, man. I really appreciate that. I like to close with an expression of gratitude. I am so grateful for you spending time with us today. I'll give you a chance. What are you grateful for today in the world, in your world?
Yeah. So, I was just saying this to a friend last week, in fact. This is a fantastic time to be alive. In my space, dealing with artificial intelligence, we have the opportunity to provide to humanity a once in a lifetime, perhaps a once in a several generation technology. But it's about more than the technology. It's a socio-technical impact that if you're following any of the news, you're seeing it's having an effect on some of the major structures and institutions that we have revolved around for centuries. And it's helping us, I won't say forcing us, but helping us to rethink some of our political apparatus. It's helping us to rethink economic models. It's helping us to rethink how and why we work. And I think if we are smart and lucky, A, we won't politicize the matter. B, we'll think about it in terms of how everyone can share in this great benefit, right? And I think to the extent that we don't politicize and we think about how everyone can participate, how there can be true equity, we'll be the better for it. I think if either of those two scenarios don't turn out to be true, we'll be far worse, far more quickly. And that's the work that I'm engaged in to make sure that latter scenario does not come true, because I'm all about the former scenario, because I do think it ushers in a new, much more, I don't want to sound utopian about it, but a much more distributed opportunity for literally everyone in the world. So that's where my focus is, and that's what I'm grateful for.
I am glad that you are there and doing your work. I am glad you have been here. Your hopefulness is contagious. I really appreciate spending time with you. So thank you for being here today.
Invitation.
All right, man. And that's another episode of Ultra Leadership. Thank you very much for listening. If you're enjoying Ultra Leadership, please take a minute and give us a review wherever you find your podcasts. And please stay in touch. Sign up for our Ultra Leadership newsletter at ultraleadership.com. Now, before you jump to your next meeting, I invite you to reflect on what you heard today. What stood out for you? What insight might you want to incorporate into your leadership practice? Until next time, remember, as a leader, you always have the power to shape the future and change lives. So go to the edge and push farther. Thanks for listening.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.